Good afternoon and welcome to this afternoon's webinar presented by the Maine Health Management Coalition titled, So You Didn't Receive a Hard Hat at Orientation, Supporting Ourselves and Others During Times of Stress. My name is Marie Stuckey. I am the Member Relations Manager here at the Maine Health Management Coalition, and I welcome you and add my thanks to our presenter today, Allegra Hirsh-Wright, who will be speaking momentarily. Before we begin with Allegra, I will just go over some quick information about the webinar. We will give you a quick overview on some of the activities going on at the coalition and information on what we do for those of you who are not members and are not really familiar with what we do. The presentation and slides will be archived and available on our website to reference later on. It usually takes a day or two after the webinar to get that up. And I would encourage you to see the chat box on your screen and use that to add questions that you can ask of our presenter, which we will address at the end of her presentation. So anytime during the webinar today, you can add your questions to that chat box and we will keep track of those and present them to her later on. So a little bit about the coalition. We are a multi-stakeholder organization. We are purchaser or employer-led, and we work together with all our stakeholders, which include consumer groups, purchasers and plan sponsors, health plan brokers and benefit consultants group together, providers and affiliates. And all these groups work together to improve the health and value of healthcare services in the state for everybody in Maine. The way we envision this is by hoping to have Maine lead the country in population health status, patient care experience, and reasonably priced per capita healthcare expenditures so that we have a favorable business climate and strong economic growth and job development. At the present time, we are just shy of 80 members, and so we are growing and very appreciative of everybody's involvement. The way that we achieve our goal and our vision is through 5 key areas. We have a data department, which is the foundation for improvement, managing with facts. And we have access to all the claims, the benefit claims in the state to provide analysis and data on people's plans and how well they're working. Another initiative we undertake is transparency and public reporting through our website, GetBetterMaine.org. And on this website, we publicly report the outcome, safety, patient experience, and cost ratings for adult care, pediatrics, and specialties. So those quality ratings are very meaningful for finding the best care. We also help our members and those in the state to engage their employees in whether it's their own self-care, community initiatives, providing them resources on information for what they need to do to manage everything from diabetes to cancer and just basic wellness. We also work on benefit design and have a value-based insurance design plan in development with all the major health plans in the state that rewards the use of high-quality, patient-centered care. And finally, we have a payment reform group that works together to have agreements on payment arrangements for high-quality, patient-centered care at a reasonable cost. So some of the benefits of membership in the coalition include being able to network and convene, working together with all the different multi-stakeholders that have a stake in the game to improve the quality and value of healthcare in the state. We help identify best practices in health plan design and workplace wellness. Again, referencing our great data analytics team. We can help with training for leadership and staff through educational events. And this is also membership is a good way to brand your organization as a pioneer in support of Maine's economy and health, and that's really important to employers these days in trying to recruit good talent. Some of the ways that we drive this change is through our work groups, and our members are very involved in those work groups, working through different decisions to make the value of healthcare in the state improve. And then, of course, we have free webinars such as this. There's voting rights and discounts on products and services, so all sorts of great benefits of membership. Some of the opportunities to network and learn and influence include the work groups, as I referenced. We're working on some great learning collaboratives for 2016. People can also get involved in voting on public reporting initiatives and for seats on our board. We're working towards setting up some provider and employer roundtables where we can get people actually talking to each other to make positive change. And members receive a complimentary registration to our annual symposium, which just passed. It was great, and we appreciate all the wonderful participation. We also have a member newsletter, training on value-based insurance design, the webcasts we've mentioned. In the past, we've done a little bit of evidence-based medical policy training for policymakers, and some of our members have enjoyed member-only employee engagement pilot programs. And then I did also already mention some discounts that we're able to offer for our members. This is just a quick list of our members that's growing off the page, I see, and some of our member logos. And now I will get to the feature of today and introduce Allegra Hirsh-Wright, licensed clinical social worker and registered yoga trainer. She's a clinical implementation coordinator for the Maine Children's Trauma Response Initiative, a SAMHSA-funded National Child Traumatic Stress Network project site. Allegra oversees implementation of evidence-based trauma treatment statewide, provides training locally and nationally on multiple topics related to working with children exposed to violence and trauma, and is a nationally certified TF-CBT clinician and clinical supervisor. Allegra is a contributing member of the NCTSN Secondary Traumatic Stress National Work Group and has contributed to the development of fact sheets and a national website on secondary traumatic stress. Allegra has also co-authored an article on childhood exposure to violence and has contributed to a published book on childhood traumatic grief. She has extensive experience in the field of trauma, both primary and secondary training and community outreach. And with that, we will turn the controls and slide decks over to Allegra. And thank you so much for presenting today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that fabulous introduction. I appreciate it. So today we are going to talk a little bit about stress and about how do we manage through these stressful times that we're in, as well as how do we help support others, whether it's those that we're working with, whether it's those that we supervise, or just others in our lives, about how do we sort of help them support themselves when they're feeling stressed and experiencing some of the reactions that we know can happen when we're feeling extreme stress. So we're going to talk about that today, and I appreciate you all sharing some of your time this afternoon with me. So to start off, I'm going to give you a little stress test, just to sort of get a basic or sort of a base for where we all are today. So the stress test, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a slide on the screen, and it's going to be a picture of two dolphins. The picture is mostly similar, although there are some differences between the two dolphins. And what this test has actually shown is that those who are experiencing higher levels of stress will actually notice more differences between the two dolphins, and those that are experiencing lower levels of stress will notice less differences. So what I want you to do is just take a look for yourself and just notice, does the amount of differences that you see on the slide really represent how stressed you may be feeling in the moment, and then we'll go ahead and chat about that. So in case everybody is freaking out at the moment as you're sitting at your desk and looking at this slide and going, oh my God, I see so many differences. I must be more stressed than I thought I was. What I will say is that actually this is a picture of a dolphin and a cow, not two dolphins. So in case you haven't sort of seen this by now, this is not a real stress test. It's really more on here to do two things. So the first is to get folks to laugh, which it invariably does. And I find laughter so important, and we'll talk about that as we continue to spend more of our time together in this next hour. But laughter is really, really important and has some not only really beneficial physiological benefits, but really does great things for our overall emotions and our overall mood. And so being able to incorporate laughter into our everyday, into multiple times of our day, I find is really important. And I like to do that in the work that I do, and so I start this off with a little bit of laughter. The second reason why I have this on here is because the reality is that even if this was a real stress test, we all would have seen differences among the two dolphins because we all experience stress. And I think that, you know, there's, and we'll talk in a little bit about sort of the different kinds of stress that we experience, but we all have levels of stress. There's stress related to the work that we do. There's stress related to our families and our personal commitments and responsibilities. And there's stress with just living in a state where, at least as far as last winter, it snowed about 30 inches of snow every other day, and having to deal with those pieces. So the reality is that we are in a stressed time. And we as a human species, and more so we as an American culture, I feel like don't really have great ways to relieve ourselves of that stress. We're in this society where we're always thinking about the next thing. We're trying a lot to talk about mindfulness and about being in the moment and in the present. But the reality is that for a lot of us, even if we're trying to really be in the moment and in the present, we're oftentimes thinking about things that we need to do in the next hour, in the next afternoon, in the next few days, even in the next month. And so we continue to build the stress that we experience. And so I think one of the ways to start, one of really simple ways to start, is actually to take our cue from animals, much like the deer that you hopefully see on your screen right now. And for those of you that don't know, if a deer gets stressed, so let's say it runs out in front of your car as you're driving, or it's being chased by a predator in the woods, a deer will stop after that stressful interaction is over. And before it can go on to continue to do what it was doing in the moment, it needs to relieve itself of that stress. And the way that it does that is it shakes its whole body. And so you may see this sometimes where you see a deer standing there and it will literally shake its whole body. And it does that as a way to re-regulate itself. It does that because it knows instinctively that that's a way to decrease our cortisol levels, which is a hormone that increases when we're stressed. It decreases our heart rate. It lowers our blood pressure. It allows us to take more deep and more meaningful breaths. And so it really is a way that they de-stress themselves. And so I really try and take this piece of information and use it. In fact, Taylor Swift recently wrote a song that really helps with that called Shake It Off. And so I invite you at times when you're feeling really stressed to maybe turn on that song or another song, maybe the Hokey Pokey or some song like that helps you literally shake it off, because that can be really, really beneficial. So we're talking about this stress today because of that. And then, you know, there's this additional stress that we feel as well. And this is the stress of interacting with folks who are experiencing a lot of suffering and loss. And what I would say is, even if you're not in a career where you're interacting really significantly, you're interacting daily with people who have experienced suffering and loss, or at least that you know of, we are all, as a society, still immersed in suffering and loss. There's so much of this going on in the world right now. There's so much discord occurring in the world right now. And that's really causing a lot of anxiety and a lot of fear and a lot of stress among us. And we know that that does impact us. And so we're going to spend the rest of our time today talking about how that impacts us and what we can do about it. So the first place to start is really to talk about some of the definitions and really be able to tease some of these pieces out. So the first place that we really want to be is in this place of compassion satisfaction. So compassion satisfaction essentially is, what it boils down to is got joy. So do you have or do you find pleasure in the work that you're doing, and most specifically the work that you're doing well? So no matter what it is that you do during the day, when you go home at night and you're lying in bed, as a lot of us do, sort of rehashing the day, maybe rehashing some stressful moments in our day, are you able to say that even though it was a stressful day, even though maybe you had some stressful interactions, that you still feel like you did your work well, that you still feel like you contributed positively to those situations or to the various pieces of your job that you did that day? And if you're able to go to that place and really be able to focus on what made today a good day, then that's when you're finding yourself in compassion satisfaction. And that's where we want to be. When we're not in those places, we're in periods of stress. And so it's helpful to be able to learn a little bit about what are those different types of stress and then what occurs from them. So stress in and of itself is simply a reaction to a stimulus that disturbs our physical or our mental equilibrium. So we're going along this path and things are pretty okay and we're feeling like we're pretty equal, and then all of a sudden something happens and it disturbs that balance. And so there's two really different kinds of stress. There's good stress, and then there's bad or toxic or distress or toxic stress. So good stress is things like having a baby, buying a house, getting married, things like that, things that we typically look forward to, things that we typically invite into our lives, that we want in our lives, yet we know are still really stressful as we're preparing for them and planning them and going through the different processes of moving through those different situations. We then also have what we call distress or bad stress or toxic stress. And this stress is really when we're exposed to that suffering, when we're exposed to violence, when we're exposed to trauma, when we're exposed to things called adverse childhood experiences. Those things can cause what we know is toxic stress, which is stress that can really start to be harmful, potentially be harmful to our emotional and our physical health. We also know that there's just sort of everyday neutral stress, which is really things like change, whether it's change in your personal life or change in a job or a career, as far as change in staffing or change in a policy or something like that. Neutral stress are things like the snow that I mentioned last year in the state and the amounts of it that we received, things like an annoying driver in front of you on the way to work, things like that are sort of, they're stressful in the moment, but maybe we can typically let them go as the moments pass. And so it's important, I think, to really recognize that there are these different types of stress, especially when we're talking about the neutral stress or the good stress, and recognizing that those can have an impact on us as well. So when we start to talk about what that impact is, there's a couple of different terms that we talk about. The first term is a term that is really used across the board to talk about really the state of emotional and physical exhaustion, especially when we're involved in really emotionally demanding situations or stressful situations. And so this term is known as burnout. And when I think of burnout, I think of it much like the match that you see on the screen, and that is there's this match lit and we all sort of have this fire in us to do what it is that we're doing. And then as we start to experience burnout, which is a gradual thing that we experience, we start to see this slow, gradual smoldering of and burning out of that flame. So when we talk about burnout, we talk about really this concept of goodness of fit and lack of fit in an area. And when we're talking about burnout, we're talking about this goodness or lack of fit in the 6 areas that you see on the screen that are really related to our job environment. So not necessarily the job that you do, but where you do that job. And these 6 areas are things related to workload and control and community and values and fairness and reward and the various things that go in with those. And what we notice is that when we start to see a lack of fit, or when we feel a continued lack of fit in one or more of these areas over a period of time, that's what can cause burnout. And so that's really a significant piece that I think is important to know, is that we all will experience a lack of fit in one of these areas or a couple of these areas over times within our careers, especially if we stay within the same agency or the same company for a really long time. There's going to be times where you may feel like the rewards, the pay that you're getting, or the recognition that you're getting, or the satisfaction you have in your job may sort of waver from day to day or go up and down from day to day. There may be times where you feel like you have more on your workload than you do resources to be able to manage what's on your workload. And so we recognize that this can happen on sort of a not a consistent basis, but that every once in a while this can happen. And when that happens, that doesn't typically lead to burnout. What typically leads to burnout is when we're experiencing this lack of fit in one or more of these areas over a period of time, over days, over months, and potentially over years. And we're really not sorry, and we really don't see an improvement, even though we're using our voice and we're talking about it and we're going to supervisors and going to management and really talking about ways that we can start to increase the goodness of fit in these areas. If we don't see that increase, then we start to experience this piece that's known as burnout. Then we also have this piece that we call compassion fatigue. And compassion fatigue, when Charles Figley and Carla Joinson, who were two that really did a lot of research around this term, they were really starting, when they did this research, they were doing it specifically related to folks who were working with people who had experienced violence and trauma, so a trauma survivor. And so they came up with this definition of that. Compassion fatigue is the emotional distress that we may experience when having had close contact with somebody who's experienced trauma. But what we're really starting to see from more and more research is that compassion fatigue really encompasses this overall experience that we may have, and that can include burnout, and it can include also terms, things like vicarious trauma and secondary traumatic stress, which can be more specifically related to being exposed to violence and trauma, whether it's somebody that we're working with, or whether it's secondarily being exposed to it, like watching it in the media, which we tend to be exposed to a lot of the time. And so we're really starting to use this term as sort of this general feeling of emotional distress when we've been in situations that are stressful and that really feel like that stressful situation overwhelms our ability to really manage that. Then we start to have this feeling of compassion fatigue, where we are really emotionally and physically exhausted and really feeling like we just can't do this anymore. So I believe it's helpful to start talking about, so how really prevalent is this? Because I think for a lot of us, we try and go around and feel like we're not stressed or report that we're not stressed. I think a lot of times it can be seen as a weakness to report that you're stressed or that you're overwhelmed. And so I think for a lot of us, we may feel like it's sort of an us-them kind of a thing, and I don't experience it, but they experience it. And so I think it's really important to recognize that there's actually a lot of us that are really experiencing it. So this statistic that you see here came from the APA and the American Institute of Stress report, and they broke it down and looked at different areas of the country, and really looked at which areas were experiencing what levels of stress. And what you'll see is that those of us on the East Coast and those of us in the Eastern region are reporting higher levels of stress than in other regions. And I don't know if that has to do with, there wasn't a breakdown about if that had to do with weather or if that had to do with other types of things. But I think it's really significant to note that those of us in the Eastern region are reporting higher levels of stress. In the past year, as many as 4 in 10 adults report that their stress levels have increased. And we also know that about 38% of adults in the Eastern region report that their stress level has increased in the last year. We also know that in the U.S. industry, the U.S. workforce industry, the job stress, so stress related to the work that we do and the work environment that we do it in, costs the U.S. industry about $300 billion annually. And that's when we think of things like folks calling in sick and injuries and all kinds of various things that go into what happens and some of the reactions that occur when we experience stress. So I think it's really important to see some of these, to really recognize that we do experience really high levels of stress, especially here in the Eastern region. I also think it's important to look at, so like we talked about burnout and compassion fatigue, and so what are those levels of stress, and what are those levels that folks are experiencing? So in just a couple of surveys that I found, in one there was about 5,000 U.S. workers that were surveyed, and 63% reported high levels of stress at work. And 39% of that group reported that workload, so the amount of work that they are responsible for, is their top source of stress. I also want to say that one of the things that they talked about, that when they experienced the stress, that they experienced it as really extreme fatigue and feeling out of control. And what they also reported, this 39% that reported that the workload is their top source of stress, medical reasons or caregiving responsibilities. So they found their workload more stressful than medical reasons that they may be experiencing or caregiving responsibilities that they had. There was a survey of about 740 healthcare workers, so this included doctors, nurses, administrators, anybody that works in a healthcare field, and 34% of them had planned to look for a new job due to feeling burnt out. And then you'll see a very specific survey here done with social workers specifically, where almost half of them met at least one core criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder. So what that meant was that if they walked into a psychiatrist's office or the office of somebody who could diagnose a mental health disorder, that they met one of the core criteria for that mental health disorder of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's a pretty significant number when we look at all sort of different areas of workforce in the U.S. That's pretty significant number of folks that are experiencing burnout and compassion fatigue and overall stress. So what does this look like? How will I know if I'm experiencing it? How will I know if those that I'm working with or those that I'm supervising are experiencing it? So what we might see are some of these things. So if you think about sort of the personal impact and ways that it impacts not necessarily the job, which we will go to in a minute, but just personally, what might you see in yourself and what might you see in others? So I'm not going to go read through every single one of these, but just to pull out a couple of them. So we notice that there's physical changes. So there may be changes in appetite. There may be changes in sleep patterns. You may be sleeping a whole lot more, or you may be having a lot harder time sleeping. We see a lot of times somatic complaints, so things like getting a lot of headaches or stomach aches or other types of aches and pains are often due to stress. We see mood changes, so things like something that normally you could let roll off your back that was just kind of an annoyance, now is really, really, really bothering you and you can't let it go. Things like that. We see relational changes, so withdrawing from those peer supports, withdrawing from those connections, withdrawing from folks that you normally hang out with at work, that you normally find comfort in, that you normally find friendship in, and not really doing those things. So if you're somebody that normally has lunch with a group of people, are you noticing that now you're eating lunch at your desk or in your cubicle by yourself and not really wanting to connect with others? We also see some changes in cognitive functioning. So feeling like you're having a harder time concentrating, feeling like you're losing focus or perspective, things like recognizing that you're reading through something and you notice that you're reading the same paragraph over and over again and it still doesn't make sense to you. Having difficulty making decisions, right? A lot of us, I think, at the end of, I know this is something that happens for me at the end of a long day, and I'm asked, what do you want for dinner? I have a really hard time making that, what can seem like a very simple decision, but in the moment feels like a really, really challenging decision. And then in behavior, we see sometimes use of ineffective or unhealthy coping skills. We see changes in routine. And sometimes we'll see things like accident prone. So if you start to notice that you're tripping more or falling more or experiencing more accidents and that's not like you, that may be a sign that you're experiencing high levels of stress and or burnout. We also see some disconnection from our spirituality. And so when I talk about spirituality, what I really am, for me, what I'm talking about is those pieces that really fill your soul. And so that could be faith, that could be through religion, and that could be through connection with others, that could be through a hobby, that could be through other, really anything that really fills your soul. And so are you noticing that there's a disconnection from that? Are you noticing that you are finding that you're not connecting to those things as much as you used to? So those might be some of the ways that you notice in yourself or in others that maybe you are having high levels of stress or burnout or compassion fatigue. When we think about how it impacts us and the job that we're doing, what we know is that we can see changes in our job tasks. So we can see a decrease in the quality or quantity of work that we're doing. We can see some increased mistakes. We can also see increased perfectionism, so that thought that I'm the only one that can do this and I'm the only one that can do this perfectly, and so I have to do it and nobody else can do it. So we see less being able to share responsibilities and more taking everything on your own because you now believe that you're the only one that can do it and it has to be done perfectly. A lot of what we're seeing these days is sort of a disengagement or lack of engagement within among staff, and so a loss of interest in the job, a negative attitude, a sense of detachment. Sometimes it comes out as a decreased confidence in the job that we do. So you may start to hear folks saying, "I don't really think I'm good at that anymore. Nobody really got anything out of what I did, or I don't feel like I have anything to offer anymore." We may see those changes in interpersonal connections. So again, I talked about before about, are you somebody that was having lunch with colleagues and now you're disconnecting from that? Are you not connecting with or not communicating with your supervisor or with your employer about things? Are you starting to notice more staff conflicts or impatience with other colleagues or staff that you're working with? And then this is where we also see a lot of behavioral changes. So exhaustion, we see absenteeism, we see increased irritability, we see sometimes overworking ourselves. And going back to the absenteeism piece, one of the things that one of the statistics that I came across was that about 60% of call outs, so when folks call out or call in sick to work, about 60% of them are not actually related to a physical health condition, so having a cold or the flu or something like that. 60% of it is related to stress, is related to burnout, and is related to compassion fatigue. So I think that that's something really to hold on to, especially if you're an employer or a supervisor, and starting to look at maybe those who may be calling out frequently, and starting to look at, are there other things that may be going on or that may be contributing to them experiencing more colds or things like that, that's not just a physical piece. So I think being able to hold those pieces of information is really important as well. So we've talked about how frequent this is, we've talked about how this impacts us, and now let's talk about, so what do we do about it? So there's been this ongoing debate about whether or not we could prevent or just manage stress, and for a long time there was this thought that we could prevent it, and I think what that did was that set this up, or that set the stage up for, if there were folks who weren't preventing it, then there must be something wrong with them. So here's ways to prevent it, and I can prevent it, but if they can't prevent it, then what's wrong with them that they can prevent it? Rather than recognizing that stress is something that none of us can prevent. We can't stop us from being stressed or stop stressful interactions from happening. So we have to start looking at it as we know it's inevitable, and so now we need to put our energy and focus in how do we manage it. So there's really some basic ways, and so the first way is to build awareness, and that's what part of what you're doing today by participating in this webinar and finding out more information about it, but continuing to build awareness about what stress is, what compassion fatigue is, what burnout is, what it looks like, and then what you can do to manage it. But also building awareness about yourself, about your personality, about how you interact with people, about how you interact with different situations. Are you somebody that has typically sort of an anxious personality, or are you somebody that has sort of a less anxious personality? Because while neither one of those is bad or worse than the other, what we know is that both of those personalities, you're going to interact in certain situations in different ways. You're going to react to situations in different ways. So being able to know that about yourself is going to help you recognize how you might react to that situation, and then how you might be able to manage some of those reactions that might not be so beneficial. Avoiding self-care pitfalls. So we all have them. We all have really, really good reasons why we may not be able to attend to self-care the way that we would like to. A lot of it is time, a lot of it is money, a lot of it is other responsibilities, whether it's family responsibilities or outside of work responsibilities. And so those oftentimes take us into different directions that aren't really about taking care of ourselves. And so figuring out ways to be able to avoid some of those self-care pitfalls that you have. So is it a time, if it's a time situation, is there a way that you can look at what are some things that I can do that maybe don't take an hour out of my day, but maybe take 5 minutes out of my day? And we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a moment. Building and maintaining connections, you're going to hear me say a lot about this today, but we are, as a human species, a species that thrives on connection. And even those of us that are really introverted and need some of our alone time to be able to recharge, we still thrive on that connection, and we need that connection. And so being able to build those connections both in your careers and in your professions, but also outside of your professions as well, so that when you're at home, when you're not at work, you can really disengage and disconnect from the work. Knowing your triggers, so these are not just triggers if you have stress or trauma in your own history, but just knowing what your buttons are, what normally sort of annoys you, and being able to recognize those is going to be really important, again, because then you're going to know if you're going into an interaction with somebody who typically pushes your buttons, it's going to be helpful to know that so that you can be able to do something proactively before you get too stressed in that situation. And then finding inspiration, so coming back to what motivates you, coming back to that piece that can get you into that place of compassion, satisfaction. What motivates you? Why are you doing this job? Why do you continue to come back to this job? And so this is, because I talked about laughter, this is a slide that just talks about that piece a little bit. Where really it's this gentleman who's sort of falling over and has dropped his papers, and his colleagues come to rush to help him, and he says, really, I'm fine. It was just a fleeting sense of purpose. I'm sure it will pass. And I think for a lot of us, we sort of tend to do that because, again, we're going on to the next thing and moving on to the next thing. And I think as a society, we need to sit in that place of that sense of purpose and really sit with that and hold that to be able to connect back with that. So talking about resilience, so what are some proactive ways that you can help support yourself and others? And so what are some proactive ways that you can build your personal resilience? So when we talk about resilience, we're really talking about this definition here about the process of adapting well when we are faced with adversity or a tragedy or a threat. But also, and more specifically, really resiliency is really about bouncing back. It's about when something challenges us, how do we bounce back from that challenge? And so there are various ways to be able to build that resiliency. So I think about building resiliency of our emotional selves, much like I think about building resiliency of our physical selves. So I build the resiliency of my teeth by brushing my teeth daily. And so by incorporating some or all of these things that we're going to talk about into my daily life, that's how I'm building my emotional resiliency. And a lot of these things, you'll notice, are a lot of ways that we can counter some of that immediate stress that we may be experiencing. So countering isolation, we've talked a lot about that connection piece, so being able to connect with others. Having that mindful awareness, again, not only mindful awareness about being in the moment and being in the present, but also that mindful awareness about who you are, how you interact with people, how you react to things, and what you bring to situations. Embracing complexity. In a world where there's a lot of gray, a lot of us like that black and white. We like that right or wrong. We like it to be one way or another way. But we live in a world where there's a lot of gray and a lot of complexity and a lot of ambiguity. So really being able to embrace that and recognize that that doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. Having some optimism. And so not just the piece about is your glass half empty or half full, but really being able to see some of the optimism in pieces, being able to see the strength, being able to see the resilience in others and in a situation. Having holistic healthcare, so not just thinking about our physical and emotional healthcare, but thinking about things like aesthetic healthcare. So what does your environment look like? Do you find it beautiful? Do you find the beauty in the environment around you? And if not, how can you incorporate some of that into your environment? Thinking about our spiritual healthcare. So again, thinking about connections that really fill our soul. So, and what are some ways that you can continue to do that? Thinking about setting limits and boundaries. A lot of us, at least I'll speak for myself, have a hard time saying no. But being able to say no and setting some limits and some boundaries, not only in our professional lives, but also in our personal lives, can be really beneficial. And I think sometimes that also includes people, and we recognize that oftentimes there are people that are stressful or that we find stressful when we interact with them that we can't completely limit out of our lives or put a boundary around, but can we make some kind of limitation so that we're not interacting with that stress or exposing ourselves to that stress maybe as much as we might otherwise be. Thinking about empathic engagement, so thinking about empathy and that ability to open ourselves up and really take the perspective of somebody else and hold on to that, to be able to sit in the emotion that somebody else may be sitting with and just holding that emotion with them, but doing that in a way that's helpful for them and that's empathic for them, but also in a way that's empathic and helpful for you as well. having satisfaction in your job. So going back to those 6 different areas where we'd like to see a goodness of fit, and recognizing, are you really satisfied with your job? Because that's a challenging thing. And I don't say that as if you're not, then it's really easy to go out and get a new job. But I think being able to recognize, do you have more mornings where you wake up and you're really struggling because you really don't like your job? I think being able to recognize that and then look at other ways to find satisfaction in other areas until you're able to make potentially some changes within your job to be able to get a little bit more satisfaction with that. And then finally, making meaning. And so being able to recognize that making meaning out of a situation can really help reduce the threat of stress and trauma. And so when I talk about making meaning, I'm not just talking about a piece of sort of saying, oh, this bad thing happened or this awful thing happened and that's okay, but it's really about recognizing that there's strength and resiliency in moving through stressful situations. And if we can connect with that strength and we can connect with that resiliency, then that's a way to make meaning of it and a way to be able to recognize that we maybe gained something from it in a way that we may not have previously. So being able to really think about those things and incorporating some of these pieces into your everyday is going to help build that resiliency so that you can bounce back a little bit more easily when something stressful happens. So some very specific things that you can do, and I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but I'll pull out some pieces that we may know or may not know, but that have really some specific benefits. So we know that exercising and eating healthy is really beneficial to us. And so do you have a way that you can implement a plan? I think we see this a lot around New Year's, and a lot of people make New Year's resolutions of, oh, I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to do it 4 times a week and I'm going to work out for 60 minutes each time. And I think what happens is we have a lot of gung-ho and we have a lot of interest in doing that, and then we recognize that that's really hard to maintain, especially if we're not typically maintaining it. And so then we tend to fall off and we tend to not do that anymore. So can you make a smaller goal, a more measurable goal that allows you to get some of those benefits and increase towards a larger goal? So rather than starting off with a goal of 4 times a week at an hour a time at the gym, can you do maybe a half-hour walk twice a week around your neighborhood? Or can you do a half hour at the gym twice a week, kind of a thing? So figuring out ways to start small to be able to work up to a larger goal. Vacations, this is huge. I saw a statistic where only 30% of workers in the U.S. take their vacation time. So if you have vacation time, take your vacation time. It doesn't mean you have to go anywhere. It just means to be able to disconnect from the job that you do and focus on other things that feed your soul, on other things that make you that help you recognize what you have to offer yourself, what you have to offer your family, what you have to offer your community. Music is huge. There's tons of research that shows that music helps decrease the sensation and the distress of pain. It has improved symptoms related to depression and has shown to increase self-esteem in elderly. It also has been shown to decrease anxiety, improve memory, improve immune functioning, and actually helps us exercise. So when you're in your car, turn on the radio and sing at the top of your lungs. When you're in your living room, turn on the radio and dance to 3 songs. That's exercise and getting music all in the same bat. Visualization can help, being able to picture something that's really calming and feels safe to you, and humor is really, really helpful. So those are some things that you can do when you're outside of the office. Here are some things that you can do when you're at work, when you're in your office and you maybe have a little bit of time or more time. So doing some breathing and mindfulness skills, being able to stretch, get up. If you're in a position where you sit at your desk a lot, being able to get up and move around, doing some stretching exercises, walking around your building, whether it's inside or outside, can be really helpful. Being able to take a time out, being able to listen to music is helpful. Having a self-care buddy at work, so somebody that you can say, hey, look, this is what it's going to look like when I'm really stressed. And if that happens, if you notice this in me, can you just pull me aside and do a little check-in? Because I may not notice it in myself first. It may take somebody else noticing it for me. Finding ways to transition to home. So what are ways that you can disconnect when you go home at the end of the day? What are ways that you can really say, this is the stuff that needs to stay at work, and I'm not going to take it into my home with me, and finding ways to be able to do that. For a lot of us, I think, it's when we get home, we take off our work clothes and put on sweatpants or put on our home clothes. That's a great way to really be able to transition. And then I have humor here, and again, because again, humor is so important. There's so many benefits. One of the benefits of laughter is that if you laugh, a really full belly laugh for 10 minutes, you get the same benefits as if you spent 10 minutes on a rowing machine. I think that's amazing. There's another statistic that I heard that children laugh about 300 times a day, and adults laugh about 15 times a day. And I think part of that is because we don't play as much. So I think we need to start figuring out how do we play more in our lives so that we can bring laughter into our lives. The other thing that laughter does is it increases our immune boosting hormones, and it suppresses our depressive depressive reactions, and that reaction lasts for up to 45 minutes after you've laughed. So there's some really, really, really great benefits of laughter. So supporting staff. So if you're somebody that is an employer, you supervise staff, what are some things that you can do? So some of the ways is looking at control, and this is going back to those 6 areas of fit that we looked at before. So can you create a culture of accountability where people are demonstrating ownership to achieve an organizational result? Because if you can do that, then that allows folks to really be able to believe that even though they may have a high workload, that they have ownership, that they have a sense of accomplishment and of supporting the overall organization and function of the organization. It's a way to include employees in the process, which is a way to be able to help them feel control, and is a way to be able to help them feel better about their job that they're doing. Being able to embrace failure. We see a lot of research that shows that creative solutions most often come from trial and error rather than just getting it right the first time. So being able to embrace that failure and saying it's okay that you made a mistake. So maybe really do something like applaud the mistakes, and recognizing that that's how we learn. Looking at rewards. So this is not just about money. I know that we're in a really stressful fiscal times and a lot of people go to that, but it's not just about money. It's about gratitude for employees and what they bring to the organization. It's about recognition. It's about recognizing that workers who have perceived that their managers, administrators value and recognize the work that they're doing are more likely to report work satisfaction. And we know that from multiple studies across the board and across different professions. Recognizing ways to build community. So we've talked a lot about that connection in community. So what are ways to do that? Can you have lunches where the entire team comes together? Can you have off-site connections or times for people to connect where they can really maintain that connection? And then looking at engagement differently. This is a really huge buzz term right now. We talk about engagement. But Towers Watson, which is a consulting firm, surveyed about 32,000 employees in about 29 different markets around the world, and what they found was that engagement, as we traditionally defined it, really no longer creates the highest levels of performances. So what they came up with was this term called sustainability engaged, and that's really employees who felt that their companies energized them by supporting their physical, emotional, and social well-being. What they also reported was that the 2 top drivers of performance were having a leader who built trust by demonstrating a sincere interest in their own well-being, and having a manageable stress level with a reasonable work-life balance. So as employees and supervisors, if we can help create an environment where that is what is felt by our employees, we're going to see greater success, not only in them taking care of themselves and being emotionally and physically well, but greater outputs as well. So what are some ways to do this in the moment, and what are some ways to be able to do this on that small, more measurable scale? Well, this is really, I think, a great way, and it comes out of 2 areas. One was a woman that I saw present on topics like this, and another is from the Because I Said I Would movement, which is a movement that really recognizes that when we make a promise out loud to somebody, or when we write it down, that we're more likely to hold ourselves accountable. So what I like to do is look at these 3 steps to managing stress. The first is to increase our awareness, which again we've done today, and you can continue to do by reading about it, by increasing your awareness about yourself and how you react to things. Then being able to identify. So identify one thing that you can do by next Tuesday to help decrease your stress just a little bit. And this can oftentimes also include identifying one person who can help you do that. So maybe the thing you identify is, I'm going to go on a half-hour walk between now and next Tuesday. And I don't know that I'm much more likely to do it if I call my best friend. So I'm going to identify my best friend as somebody who can call me up and say, let's go for a half-hour walk, and I'm going to do it. And then decide to do it and do it by next Tuesday. And so sometimes this could mean by writing it down for yourself. Sometimes this could mean by calling your best friend and saying, between now and next Tuesday, I want you to call me and say we're going on a half-hour walk. However you can do this, however you can figure this in, really deciding to do it and then following through is how you're going to start making more of those steps towards being able to manage and decrease your stress. And when we're doing those things, I also want to just remind us to really be in the moment of this piece of self-care and this piece of being able to manage our stress. So unlike, we'll call him Steve here on his yoga mat, who gets a phone call and says, can I call you back at, I'm in a moment here, being able to disconnect from everything else and really being in that moment, whether that's getting on a yoga mat, whether that's going for a walk, whether that's spending time with family or friends, whether that's disconnecting with a book, however that looks, whether it's going for a hike, however that looks, really being able to be in that moment and focusing on how you can manage your stress and how you can help continue to build your personal resiliency. And so when we think about all this, as we come to sort of the end of our time together today, I think, you know, one of these things, there's questions is, why does this matter? Why do we talk about this? And so I think the best way that I've seen it explained is really by this quote here by Confucius. And what Confucius said was that to put the world in order, we must first put the nation in order. And to put the nation in order, we must first put the family in order. And to put the family in order, we must first cultivate our personal life. We must first set our hearts right. And so I think the final thought that I leave you with, and what this quote really boils down to, is that we all do this fabulous work out there, and we connect with folks in all kinds of various ways, and we do it in ways that are kind and compassionate. And what I ask you is, why do you deserve any less? And with this thought that caring for yourself and caring for your employees and supervisees really results in being more effective professionally, a more effective family member, a more effective friend, and a more effective being as we're moving through this life that we're in. So I know that we're going to have some time for questions, but I just wanted to offer these couple of resources. So this is, the top one is the Professional Quality of Life Screening, which you can go on. It's a free screening tool and has also the scoring, which really this can help you see what levels of compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma and burnout that you may be experiencing. And so this is a tool that I actually use myself every few months. I take it and just sort of see where I'm at. The other is the National Child Traumatic Stress Network Secondary Traumatic Stress webpage. You can go in there and there's a fact sheet, and there's also different tabs where you can go through and get more specific information about compassion fatigue and secondary traumatic stress and ways to support yourself and others. And then finally is a book by Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky, which is written with Connie Burke, called Trauma Stewardship. It's a fantastic book and really talks about how this work and how being on this planet where there's suffering almost daily, how that really impacts us and what that looks like, and then how we, not only as individuals, but how we as a larger community can really be able to help ourselves as we're moving through some of these challenging times. So before we get to questions, I just want to say thank you very much for your time. This is my contact information if you have any additional questions. But now I'd like to open it up for questions from the group.
Allegra, thank you so much for that very informative webinar. And now would be the time, if you do have questions and haven't yet done so, to please type them into the chat box. We'll start off with one that I've got here that says, how would you advise people who refrain from self-support, such as a vacation, due to the mounted pile of work they will return to?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's definitely one that I think a lot of people experience, right? Because we have so much that we're doing, and the thought of taking time off is like, well, then that's just going to add so much more work onto my caseload when I get back to the office. And what I would say is that what we know from research is that without being able to disconnect from all kinds of things, we need to have variation, we need to have disconnection, and not being able to have that actually decreases our ability to do our jobs effectively. So while it may seem like that if you don't take a vacation, you're going to get more done and be more productive, it actually is the opposite. And the way that we find more production, and what organizations and what agencies and corporations have found, was that there are employees that take really consistent and really adequate vacation time are more productive and have better outcomes than those corporations and agencies where folks are not taking vacation time.
Okay. Let's see. How would you advise HR professionals to reach out and connect with those they perceive as struggling with stress, especially if part of what they need to address is how that stress is affecting the person's work? Won't that just add more stress to the individual experiencing it if somebody reaches out to them about it?
So I think there's a couple of ways to do this, and I think it really just is about how you reach out. I think if we can reach out with compassion and with kindness, and reach out in a way where we're not blaming the person for experiencing that stress, but rather coming at it and joining with them and being able to empathize and say, I recognize that this is stressful. I know that you have a lot on your plate, and here's some of the things that I'm seeing, and I wonder if we can help support you. Oftentimes this, I would say doing this, maybe having a direct supervisor be the one to reach out and pull somebody privately aside. Sometimes this can happen in a review, and being able to say, here are the strengths that I'm seeing, and here are some things that you do really, really well, and I see that you really care about this agency, you really care about the work and what we do. But I also see that sometimes not being able to disconnect from it has more of a challenging aspect rather than a beneficial aspect. So let's talk about ways to be able to balance it so that we're seeing more of that positive piece.
Okay. What can employers do to recognize and support their employee stress? Is there an example you can provide of something that worked to increase morale and productivity throughout an organization?
So my top thought would be, which is something that really doesn't take any money and that is really beneficial all around, is finding ways to increase more laughter and more joy into the work. So whether that's instituting things like, so the team that I work on, we've instituted practical jokes, so playing practical jokes on each other. And when I say that, I'm not talking about things that are scary or that could harm somebody, so it's not like we're jumping out from behind a corner and sort of scaring somebody, but just making people laugh. So leaving a joke on somebody's desk, or a funny picture on their desk, or if you have a weekly team meeting, starting it off with a joke or a funny story. Or a funny video, something like that. We're really being able to incorporate more laughter, I think, is a way that doesn't take any time, that doesn't take any money, but that really can help change the feel of a team or an organization. It can be a really great first start.
Yeah, that's good advice. Laughter is always best medicine, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. What if it's the opposite situation and the employee doesn't find that their manager or supervisor is really getting a sense of how important self-care is? How would you advise that employee to approach their employer?
So I think I would advise them with maybe two things to look at. I think the first would be to look at recognizing that, you know, that in the end we can only control ourselves and what we do, and so how can we start with making some changes for ourselves that are going to be beneficial? I then would say, are there ways that you can talk with your employer, whether it's a direct supervisor or manager, of being able maybe to offer some of the resources or some of the statistics about how beneficial self-care is, about how beneficial it is to outcomes, it is to the overall bottom line, and being able to offer some hardcore. I know a lot of times that's when I'm talking with employers, that a lot of it is trying to figure out how to balance recognizing that they still have a bottom line they need to meet, and they still have essentially bills that they need to pay, and so how do they do that while also offering these pieces for employees. And so I think being able to offer some specifics and some specific facts about how beneficial it is a way to be able to offer some of that additional information to employers and get them to see the importance of it.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we've had a lot of questions about getting access to the slides and to the recorded presentation. So I'm just going to repeat for everybody that the slides and the recorded webinar will be available on our website probably as early as this evening. And I will send a link out to those who have attended, so you can just click on that and it'll bring you right to the page where that will be, so it's easy to find. And I just want to say thank you so much, Allegra, for sharing all this insightful information. I hope that our attendees found it useful. There will be a survey that you'll receive in about an hour, and do request that you give us your feedback so that we know how helpful you found the webinar and what future webinar topics might be useful for you. So have a great afternoon, everybody, and thank you all again so very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.